In this DVD, with some help from Gary Dunbar from the Plumbers Licensing Board, we're going to look at the basic drainage layout of a house and what interventions you as an environmental health worker can legally do in a home. Now unfortunately, most of the drainage layout of a house is hidden below the surface. So in this first DVD, we're going to look at some of the plumbing fittings we can see, or the drainage fittings we can see, and what they mean to us. And after this, Gary's going to delve a little bit deeper below the surface and have a look at these fittings in greater detail. Okay, now a good place to start is this grate that's in this bathroom floor. Now, pretty good chance underneath that grate is one of these things here, which is called a floor waste gully. All we see is the grate that's on the top, but underneath that is that trap, that bend there, and these spigots would be plumbed up perhaps to the vanity basin or to the shower or the bath. So all the water from the bath, the shower, the basins are running down through these spigots, down through here, through the floor waste gullies, through that trap and out to the drainage system outside the house. Now, there's a tendency for bits and pieces of hair and soap and fat to go down inside this grate and accumulate down the base there. And that can be quite difficult to unblock, particularly if the grate is missing. It allows much more stuff to accumulate. So if you see a house where the grate is missing, you should immediately try and replace that grate. They're fairly simple to replace. Most of the grates are just a simple twist and lock fitting, and it only takes a few seconds to screw one in. And that'll stop large items like soap wrappers and blobs of hair and fat soap going down that drain, because once it accumulates down here, it's fairly difficult to get rid of. Or you may choose one of these drain rod sets, perhaps remove the grate and insert the drain rod tool down into this and hopefully dislodge whatever muck might be in there. And if it doesn't clear, call the licensed plumber. Don't forget, this water is contaminated with germs. Make sure you use gloves and wash your hands well after using any of these tools. Okay, in the second fitting inside the house, we need to look at this thing here, which in this case is what's called an S-trap, because it looks roughly like an S. Or it could be a P-trap, where it comes out like so and then goes into the wall. It would be regarded as a P-trap. The purpose of this is to form a water seal. So water would be trapped in that U section there. Any smells that try and work their way up the tubing will get blocked by this water seal and can't escape through the actual outlet of the drain there, and will keep the smells out of your house. Unfortunately, sometimes these things do get blocked up, particularly in the kitchen sinks, where fat and tea leaves and other bits and pieces are poured down. So you need to look at some ways to try and unclear those blockages. So if you do have a blockage, one of the best ways to unblock it is using one of these plunger units. Make sure you get a decent plunger unit. This is a Master Plumber, it's got large bellows on it. Make sure there's water in the drain and plunge it up and down. You're forcing a large purge of air and water into that drain, and with a little bit of luck you'll dislodge that blockage and the drain will clear. Now another option to unclear that drain could be these liquid drain cleaners, Drano or Drain Cleaner. Most of them are very caustic or perhaps acidic and have to be used with a great deal of care. Make sure you use gloves and eye protection. Generally speaking, they're not particularly successful, but if you're lucky, you might be able to unblock a drain using one of these liquid drain cleaners. Again, make sure you use gloves, protect the eye, and keep away from things like MoFlow, which is essentially concentrated battery acid, and really only for use by licensed plumbers. A third option could be using one of these drain rods, these small sink drain rod sets. You may have to remove the P or S trap and try and slide that drain cleaner down in the pipework. It's got a small worm on the end of it, which you can turn the handle here and try and drag that worm into the blockage and extract the blockage. Generally they're not particularly successful, but you can certainly give it a try. If none of those techniques clear the blockage, call the plumber. Alright, the first fitting we're going to look at outside the house is this thing here, which is called a vent. It's plumbed into the main drainage line and it flows up the wall here through the veranda and goes onto the roof space. At the top there's a vent and it's exposed to the air. It's always a good thing to look for first because it's always between the first and the second fitting, so it gives you an idea where the head of the drainage is or the start of the drainage line. Now what's the purpose of this vent? It's got two main functions. One is to release any gases, any smells that might be building up inside that drainage line. It'll work itself up the grade of the pipe and gradually dissipate up through this pipe and out into the atmosphere, which is why it's parked onto the roof, or it's plumbed onto the roof. It allows those smells to escape and you won't smell them. The second purpose is to equalise the air pressure in the drain lines, particularly when you do things like press button A on the toilet. When you press that button, there's a huge purge of water and solids rushing down to that pipe, and it's forcing itself against the air that's in that drainage line. If you don't have somewhere for that air to go, it's going to slow down that purge and the toilet won't flush properly. By having a vent, the air can escape up through this vent and dissipate, and that toilet will flush nice and easily. And probably the best way to describe that, or show that, is this analogy with a couple of water bottles. So we're trying to draw an analogy here with the effect of the vent. So this water bottle here is a standard water bottle. We tip it upside down, and the water does flow out, but it sort of goes glug, 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 and takes a little while to flow because of that vacuum's been created behind the water as it leaves. This water bottle here, what I've done is actually drill a hole in the base, so when I turn it upside down, the water flows much easier. And that hole in the base is allowing the pressure to equalise and has roughly the effect of having that vent on our drainage system. Alright, the second fitting we need to look at outside the house is this thing here, which all we can see at this particular house is just this flap. But what it is actually is one of these things here, and it's called a dry floor waste. In your laundry, for example, you might see a grate on your laundry floor, and it may very well be hooked up to something like this grate in the floor. It runs straight out underneath the floor and out through that flap. So there's no actual bend or trap that was in the actual the bathroom floor waste gully we saw earlier on. It's quite a simple process. It's dry, there's no bend, there's no water trapped in there. It should have that flap on the outside. That flap will allow water to run should there be a flood, or there should be a drain required, but it'll also stop insects or mice or snakes perhaps going back up inside that and perhaps coming out inside your laundry, inside your bathroom. The third and last fitting we need to look at outside the home is this thing here, which is called a disconnector trap. Every home must have one, and generally speaking it looks something like this. It has a very vital function, and perhaps we look at this fitting here, we can see what's actually underneath that grate. What we're actually seeing above the surface is that grate there. Below the surface is this disconnector trap. These spigots here would run perhaps to the bathroom or perhaps the laundry trough, and the water coming through these spigots will run through this water seal or trap and head out towards our drainage system. Now the purpose of the disconnector trap is if there is a blockage perhaps further down on the drainage system and water is left running in the shower or in the basin or whatever it happens to be, and water is trying to escape, it hits that blockage, can't flow any further, and will slowly back up and back up and back up and back up, and eventually try and come out somewhere. If you don't have this disconnector trap, it'll come out inside the house and perhaps flood your house. With the disconnector trap though, the water will actually exit through here, make a little bit of a mess on your veranda, but at least it won't flood your house. You'll notice that the disconnector trap, this one that's fitted to the house, is low. It's lower than any other fitting inside the home, so the first place the water is going to come out, or the effluent is going to come out, is through this DT grate here and flood onto the veranda. There's a couple of other things you should notice about the DT, in particular the DT grate. You'll notice that it's domed, and the purpose of this dome is to stop people putting pot plants or other furniture on top of the dome, on top of the DT, sorry, and perhaps blocking off that grate. A flat one for this, like this for example, if placed on there, may allow a person to put a flower pot on top and would block that DT. That flat grate is designed for another purpose, not a DT. Okay, so it's domed, it must be loose, it's not designed to be screwed down or fixed in place. If it is, there's an opportunity for perhaps plastic or paper to cover up that DT grate and stop that effluent coming out. If it is covered up, but it is loose, then it will just simply pop off out of the way and water continue to flow. Now the problem with these DTs is that kids sometimes take the grates off and perhaps use them for a frisbee for the dog, or they get lost and the actual DT is left open. There's a tendency then for bits and pieces of rocks, rubbish to collect, and maybe kids will drop stuff down that sort of hole, and what that will do is actually fill up that trap or that bend at the bottom. In that case, what's going to happen is water trying to drain from your bath or your laundry, wherever it may be, is trying to exit through here, but it can't make it because it's blocked up with rocks and other rubbish, and will start to pour out perhaps through the actual DT onto the veranda, or even worse, back up inside the house. So if you're noticing a drain might be blocked in a house, people complaining about a blocked drain, probably the first thing you should do is go outside and check this DT. And if you notice that it's overflowing, that's perhaps where you should start, because the blockage might be in here and actually relating right back into the bathroom or the laundry. Now if you notice the DT is blocked, you need to try and unblock it. And probably the first thing you need to try is using one of these plunger units here, the 100mm plunger. And make sure you use gloves, because the effluent in that DT is contaminated with germs, so you need to protect yourself. You place the plunger down inside that DT and try and plunge that fluid up and down. There's a reasonable chance you might dislodge that blockage and force it down the drain and clear it. If the children or whatever it might be have put rocks and bits and pieces inside that drain, it's going to be a lot tougher, and you might have to resort to using perhaps a claw to loosen that stuff. Then get your hand down inside that drain and try and drag some of that rocks and that contaminants out. Be careful there's not any sharp stuff down in that DT, and make sure you use gloves. These are certainly, as a minimum, these gauntlet type gloves, but you can also get the much longer gloves which protect the whole arm. And with a bit of luck, you'll be able to drag some of those rocks out and just clear it with a plunger. So make sure you use gloves, and after you've finished, make sure you use some good hand cleaner and some antiseptic gel to make sure your hands are clean of all those germs.